Dr. Nick Kotze, the Managing Director of Agricol. I'm looking at your vision for Agricol. It says to become the leader in the South African seed industry and receive international recognition by building the Agricol brand. Now, you've somewhat achieved that, haven't you? Because you've got accolades from overseas as well. But explain to us what Agricol actually does.
Well, Tony, I would say, that certainly when you look at South African agriculture, then abroad you might find companies so specialized that they only do a specific component. They might only do maize, for example. They might only do canola, as an example. But our local industry, in many ways, the maize market is huge. In our frame of mind, but there's many other crops that's not planted, like a couple of millions of hectares. So only 50,000 hectares, only 30,000 hectares, only 300,000 hectares. And we have a full product range to cover the needs of the South African farmer. And to be able to supply those guys with good quality products as well, this is where these international alliances play a big role for us to say, well, certainly we want to have the best available, the best technology available for the local farmer, but how do we do it? It is just not economical viable to have like breeding programs now for 50,000 hectares, for 30,000 hectares, and so the smaller crops, we do run a huge evaluation program locally in all the areas to make sure that the varieties are well adapted, but then we will sign distribution agreements with international partners to allow us to market these varieties in South Africa.
Let's talk about good years and bad years, because it's a very tentative business, the grain business, and growing for farmers. They have the good years and they have the bad years. On balance, how good is South Africa as a producer?
Goodness me, that is an interesting question, Tony. I would say that we must acknowledge that we are sort of considered to be an arid part of the world. But I think we have some of the best farmers in the world. If you look at the sort of productions that we can maintain over a period of time and the sort of environment in which we do that, I think we're doing a pretty good job. It's not to say that we can't even improve on our practices. And I'm referring here to, something like minimum tillage. We have certainly seen that where you've included minimum tillage as an agricultural practice, you leave a lot more residues on the soil surface. So therefore, even the precipitation that you do get is much more effective, so you'd get less runoff, for example, you get less evaporation. Now, if you only take those two factors, you can clearly see that the end result is that there's a lot more moisture available for actually growing the crop that you want to grow. So I think, we can certainly talk to the rest or keep up our competitiveness in terms of the rest of the world. But we have a lot of challenging factors, yes. I've got confidence in the South African farmer that we can certainly keep the production levels that is required of us to feed the nation. But I think there's a few important issues that we need to secure in the process. First, it is, we don't need to interfere with our commercial farmers. At this stage, there's always the Pareto principle, the 20-10, 80%.
I'm going to interrupt you at that point there, because I can actually hear the cry from government circles. That is typical white farmer thing. We cannot afford to interfere with commercial farmers. Now, as a sensible economist, I know you're right. We can't afford to interfere with those. But are we doing enough for the aspiring black farmer? And the answer really is no, we're not.
We're not.
We do need more farmers if we're going to cope with this problem.
Very much so. So to me, I think there's plenty of land available, even on the open market. And although I don't have the statistics here at hand, there's plenty of land transferring on an annual basis.
There's a lot of government land, and worse than that, there's a lot of church land.
True, and there's a lot of so-called, areas in the Eastern Cape, for example, that's coming out of the old regime, that is now land under farming still under communal conditions, which I think, even if you look at the level of production in those areas, then certainly those production can easily be doubled and can easily be tripled.
With the assistance of emerging black farmers.
With the assistance of emerging black farmers. So I agree with you, yes, whoever we put on the land, I often think, that in my mind there is only commercial farmers. Yes, there's different levels of commercial farmers, but I don't think subsistence farming can feed the nation. I think a commercial attitude can feed the nation, whether you are small or big. But that implies, that you need to be productive. You need to use the latest and the best technology. You need to plant good quality seed, obviously. You need to follow best practices in every aspect to ensure those high levels of production.
Could you specifically say that we're able to cope with it in the year 2015, 16, 17, 18, 19 and 20? Because the statistics say we can't.
I tend to disagree with that, Tony. I think if we can ensure that even our emerging farmers are using best practices, and I'm referring to, let's say, areas where we have an annual precipitation of 800 to 1,000 millimeters. When you walk through those crops, you see a potential of 1.5 tons to the hectare. Let's talk about maize now. Now, I easily think, that yields of 5 tons, even 8 tons, and even higher can be achieved with best practices. Then when you talk to those guys, they haven't done this, they haven't done that, and I think gone is the days where we can allow those guys to almost like utilize land and then sort of, maintaining that sort of production level. So I would say yes, and again, I'm re-emphasizing the point that in my mind, we need a commercial focus. We don't need a sustainable focus in terms of small farmers. We need a commercial focus, and we need best practices to be followed. And again, maybe in terms of government support and even private sector support, what can we do to ensure the support to ensure that best practices are followed in all of those cases.
Let's take those points up, because you've brought two factors to the table on this discussion, and one is the private sector and the other is the government sector.
Yes.
Now, I'm going to drop a bombshell on the government sector one for you now and see how that affects your thinking, because we've just recently learnt that they've dropped the recapitalisation project in certain areas at government level, even though they promised the aspiring black farmers this would be for 5 years. Now that is going to really affect, because now, as we're doing this interview now, it's planting season.
Very much so.
They're not going to, your seeds you need to give to the farmers to plant now. That's all not going to happen. So can you imagine next year when the crop yield is low, how will government explain possibly 20 rand a loaf to poor people if they can't plant?
It's a tragedy. If they've stopped the recapitalisation program, I think it's the wrong thing to do, in all honesty, Tony. So that's bad news. But from private sector, we as a company, we are appointing now agronomists from those areas, speaking the local language, knowing the local culture, to try and support those communities to be more productive.
I'm glad I led you down that path, because that's the private sector part now I want to bring you into.
Yes.
What is the private sector? In other words, the big role players such as yourself at Agricol, what are you going to do to urge government to stop this kind of practice? If they wish black aspiring farmers to succeed, what are you going to do?
Well, we would like the government to show commitment. And commitment in maybe a few areas. The commitment in maybe not asking...
I hear you, and I'm going to interrupt you again.
Yeah.
I know what you'd like, but what are you going to do about it?
Well, I think, Tony, that we will obviously have to communicate with government and communicate with them the importance of not letting these guys down. We as a private sector, we can certainly support a lot. I think we as industry, there's a lot of efforts that yes, we can do our part to support, but we also need commitment of government to say, well, we need not to ask maybe who wants to own land. Because everybody of us, I think, would like to own land. It's a nice way of living. There's always, some sentiments, etc., etc. But I think the question to be asked is, who wants to be a commercial farmer? Because if you now put up your hand to say, well, I want to be a commercial farmer, both of us attended the recent Grain South African evening, where some of the emerging farmers also got recognition. Now, there's a few golden threads going through all of those if you go over the past couple of years. None of those guys actually got land from the government. They all went and bought land out on the free market. Yes, there was plenty of support systems that they used and that they recognized. Some of them, obviously, their neighbors, playing a big part in their success. Some of the support services from Grain South Africa, some of the support services of many input service providers, whether it's a seed company or a fertilizer company, to make sure that he's doing the right thing at the right time. And that's what I would like then. So yes, we need to give people security of land. We need to ensure that, yes, those support services would be available and would continue to be available, because we need to ensure that those people are successful in the long run.
Here's the nasty part to it, though. We're out of time.
We're running out of time, and we
we are. It's planting season.
Well, it's planting season, but also I think in terms of political time, we see now some other parties coming with all sorts of very radical policies. And I think we as ordinary South Africans don't want the pendulum to be out on the left. We don't want the pendulum to be out on the right. We want the pendulum somewhere in the middle, where we say, well, with this we can live, and this is really what our South Africa we want to be.
Will Dr. Nick Kotze, as the MD of Agricol, immediately act upon this information now and do something about it? Because it's in your interest, isn't it?
Very much so, very much so. And that's why I've said, we've appointed people from those communities, knowing the local culture, and language, etc., to support those, because we realize that we need a stable agricultural economy. I think in the cities, Tony, it's a worldwide phenomenon that there's more urbanization. But really, in South Africa, I think the role of agriculture is somewhere in the region of 3% of our gross domestic product. But when you then take the related industries, I suppose it's somewhere at 16%. But if you go to rural South Africa, then I would say that agriculture is pretty much the backbone of rural South Africa. And this is the areas that we talk about. So we need to stabilize those areas and make sure that those towns, doesn't shrink further, but rather boom in some way because of good productivity.